There are places that produce wine, and then there are places that produce history. On a quiet hill above Saint-Émilion, 4 medieval towers rise against the sky. They have watched empires collapse, kings negotiate power, revolutions redraw borders, and a microscopic insect nearly erasing European vineyards. To understand Château Saint-Georges, we have to go back, not centuries, but nearly 2 millennia, long before France even existed. In the 4th century, Bordeaux was then called Burdigala, and it was one of the intellectual and political centers of Roman Gaul. One of its most influential citizens was Decimus Magnus Ausonius, a famous poet who was also the tutor to the future Roman Emperor Gratian. Ausonius was an important political figure. He owned multiple estates in Aquitaine, and in his writings he described vineyard life in a way that reveals something critical. Wine here wasn't an accident. It was culture, status, and identity. Archaeological evidence confirms that a large Gallo-Roman villa stood on the exact hill where Château Saint-Georges now rises. A villa that had wealth, infrastructure, and permanent settlement. Was this villa owned by Ausonius himself? We cannot prove it definitely, but here's what we know. He owned land in this region. He wrote extensively about vineyard estates, and this hill shows clear signs of Roman viticultural activity from the same period. The legend exists because it's possible, not because it's romantic. And whether or not Ausonius actually lived here, the deeper truth remains. Viticulture on this hill predates France by over 1,000 years. But permanence in Europe has never guaranteed peace. As the Roman Empire fractured, the systems that supported villas like this weakened. Trade routes faltered and authority splintered. Stability retreated behind stone. The Roman estate did not vanish. It hardened. By the Middle Ages, the hill had transformed into a fortified stronghold. Walls thickened, open spaces narrowed. Defensive towers rose where courtyards once stood. The 4 towers that still define Château Saint-Georges were not aesthetic gestures. They were strategic necessities. From this elevation, the Barban Valley unfolds in full view. Movement across the land can be monitored. Threats could be anticipated. In a feudal world of shifting loyalties and territorial conflict, height meant control. But despite the harsh changes, wine production continued. Under a different logic, what once symbolized cultivated Roman life became an asset to defend, tax, and regulate. The hill was no longer just fertile, it was strategic, and that transformation marked its second life, which was not the end. By the early 17th century, France was emerging from decades of religious wars. Stability returned slowly under the reign of Henry IV. In 1602, the crown sold the estate to Jean Barbeau, a prominent legal figure in Bordeaux. This was not a minor rural transaction. When land passes from royal control, it signals value: economic, agricultural, and strategic. Château Saint-Georges was embedded in the politic and administrative networks of the region. The towers remained, but the purpose of the estate shifted again. No longer a frontier stronghold, it became a seat of rural authority tied to Bordeaux's expanding commercial power. Wine was no longer just a substance or status, it was commerce. But the most radical transformation arrived in the 18th century, when France entered the Enlightenment, an era defined by reason, geometry, and proportion. Architecture became an expression of intellectual order. It was during this period that the estate underwent its defining reinvention under the direction of Victor Louis, the architect behind the Grand Theatre of Bordeaux, one of Europe's masterpieces of neoclassical design. His involvement was deliberate. This was not a renovation, it was repositioning. The medieval fortress was reshaped into a symmetrical residence. Facades aligned, proportions disciplined. The building began to reflect rational elegance rather than defensive severity. Yet, the transformation did not erase the past. The towers remained. Château Saint-Georges became something rare, an architectural dialogue between eras. Medieval mass anchored Enlightenment clarity. Defense and refinement coexisted in stone. By the end of the 18th century, the estate had evolved once more, from fortified outpost to cultured residence aligned with Bordeaux's elite ambitions. But history does not reward permanence without testing it. The 19th century brought a threat no wall could repel: Phylloxera, an insect so small it was invisible to the eye, began destroying vines at their roots. Entire regions of France collapsed economically as the vineyards withered and died. Château Saint-Georges was not spared. Architecture stood untouched above the ground, but beneath the soil, the lifeblood of the estate was disappearing. The solution required tearing everything out. European vines were uprooted and replaced with grafted plants on American rootstock resistant to the pest. It was expensive, uncertain, and many estates never recovered. The decision to replant here was an act of conviction, because if the soil had been ordinary, the estate would have faded quietly into the history. Instead, it was rebuilt. The hill proved itself worth saving. At its core, the estate rests on clay and limestone soils, the geological signature of Bordeaux's right bank. Clay retains moisture during drought. Limestone endures drainage during heavy rains and forces roots deep into the mineral layers. Together, they produce structure, balance, and longevity in the vines. The vineyards are planted primarily with Merlot, king of Saint-Émilion, supported by Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon. The elevation, the highest point in Saint-Georges appellation, introduces airflow that moderates temperature and reduces disease pressure. This is not a coincidence. It is why the Romans established a villa here, why medieval builders fortified it, why Enlightenment architects invested in it, why the 19th century owners replanted all the wines. The land performs. Today, Bordeaux operates on a global stage. Reputation is measured in markets, critics, and demand. Estates without classification prestige must articulate their value with precision. Château Saint-Georges competes not by shouting, but by carrying depth. Modern stewardship continues a pattern that has defined this hill for centuries. Adaptation without erasure. The estate does not reinvent itself with every generation. It evolves. And that distinction is the reason it still stands. When you step back, a pattern becomes visible. The Romans cultivated, the medieval world fortified, the Enlightenment refined, the 19th century rebuilt, the modern era strategizes. Each generation reshaped the estate according to its priorities. Architecture changed, ownership shifted, economies rose and collapsed. Yet the hill remained central. Château Saint-Georges is not important because of a single era or a personality. It is important because it has been repeatedly validated across centuries, chosen, threatened, rebuilt, and chosen again. That is why the four towers still rise above Saint-Émilion, not as a decoration, but as evidence. This episode was filmed during a project with my client, Entre Vides, a wine tour agency in Bordeaux. Let us know in comments which other wineries you would like us to capture, subscribe to the channel for the new episodes, and like the video. Thank you for watching. See you on the next one.